welcome to. We will be recording the webinar, just so you know, and it's now being done. Welcome to our Earth Day event, and I think it's a good day to reflect. But before we actually get into the proceedings, I'd like to ask us to please have a moment of silence for the people that we have lost and for all the people in KZN who are going through quite tragic moments at the moment. So just a few minutes of silence for them. Thank you, comrades. I think that, you know, for today, we cannot move forward and without reflecting on what's been happening in terms of climate and the climate shocks that the country has been experiencing. We were talking about, we had just come out of, you know, the floods in KZN, and there were notices that we needed to, people living in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, needed to be aware of high risk of fires. And I think that that is the reality that we're in now. And it's actually going to add to some of the discussions we're having now, is that we are living in a time of climate extremes and climate shocks. Fires, floods. I think we're going to see more issues affecting our food and land. So I think that, you know, it is unacceptable for a government that knows that this is going to happen for them not to adequately prepare. One of the things, you know, our webinar today forms part of the Climate Justice Charter movement, and our push to develop policies around the issues that are coming up in our CJC, in the Climate Justice Charter. For example, the rights of nature. We're developing a water policy. Just to add that, you know, today we were planning to launch the People's Development Tool that looks at how do we actionize the deep just transition. That launch has been delayed for a short while, but I'm sure we will have it soon, and I'm sure that's going to be quite informative. I think a lot of people are joining today because they're interested in our court case, that or Colbeck's court case, and that's the discussions that will follow. I think I will hand over to Charles in a second, who will lead those discussions. But I think, firstly, thank you, comrades, for attending, and also a time to reflect on the state of our Earth on this day that's called Earth Day. So thank you for your attendance. Oh, one more thing. We also have activities and actions that are occurring around the country today to commemorate Earth Day, but also to keep those in power reminded of the kind of challenges we're facing as a country. So that's happening, and I think Charles and Awande will give us some details on where they are and what's happening. If we have any photographs, they can share it. But I'd like to then hand over to Charles for the first panel discussion, and he will give more input on that. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Feria. This webinar we are holding today, as Feria said, forms part of what we are doing as the Climate Justice Charter movement, that is developing a rights of nature policy for South Africa. We had our first webinar on this subject on the 5th of April. It was termed Beyond Sustainable Use, Redefining Our Relationship with Nature Through Harmonious Coexistence. We had our second webinar on the rights of nature, which was termed Advancing Rights of Nature and Human Rights in Africa and Beyond. You can find recordings of these webinars. They are available on YouTube. This webinar will also be uploaded on our YouTube channel. Today's webinar on defending the ocean commons, we are joined by an incredible panel. Firstly, we have Janet Solomon, who is the co-founder of Oceans Not Oil. We have Maia Nangle, research officer at Masifundise, We have Cassandra, who is a Senior Project Officer, Oil, Gas and Livelihood, South African Durban Community and Environmental Alliance. And we have Professor Singh, who is the Director of the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, acronym SAGE, and the Academy of Science of South Africa. Each one of our panelists is going to speak for a maximum of 15 minutes. And then after our panelists have finished, then we will open it up for discussion. So the order of speaking, firstly, we'll have Janet, then Maia, then Cassandra, and then we'll end with Professor Singh. Janet Solomon, I'll hand over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles, and greetings to everyone, and thanks for being here. I'm going to share my screen because I've got a presentation. Let's hope this works. Yeah, okay. Are you seeing a black screen?
Defending the Ocean Commons, planning for a just transition. We can see it, Janet.
Fabulous, thank you. Then I'm going to fire away. As participants, we've been asked to assume that an ocean commons is not only integral to planning for an urgent, just, and accelerated transitioning from an environmentally sustainable, climate resilient, and equitable economy and society for South Africa, but also that it needs defending. So let's start by examining the concept of an ocean commons in this context. And that's probably best done by comparing it to how government is framing energy transition. The place occupied by the offshore fossil fuel industry within it, how the sea and the existing ocean commons is rendered immaterial by it, and finally, what latitude there is for influencing it. This is the latest Petroleum Agency South Africa map of active licensing blocks in our oceans, referred to as the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, as an area of the ocean that extends 370 kilometers beyond the nation's territorial sea, within which the nation has jurisdiction over both so-called living and non-living resources. 93% of the ocean is dedicated to offshore oil and gas. However, there's no overarching Ocean Governance Act under which Operation Phakisa sits. There is a white paper, the National Environmental Management Act of the Ocean, which collects dust and has yet to be promulgated. There is the National Environmental Management Integrated Coastal Area Management Act 24. However, how it dovetails with the National Environmental Management Act needs definition. The Marine Spatial Planning Bill is still being worked on. There has been no strategic environmental assessment for the offshore oil and gas sector. There's a fox guards the hen house situation, since the legislative design gives function of environmental regulation to the same department mandated to promote mining, and environmental assessors are paid by the oil corporates. The Department of Mineral Resources has a poor track record of environmental regulation, transparency, compliance, and public participation processes. Only 5% of our oceans are protected, and the Department of Environment and Fisheries only possesses appellate jurisdiction. Operation Phakisa's ocean imaginary is extremely risk tolerant. Remember that Sasol and ENI's application offshore Richards Bay and Scottsboro was to drill exploratory wells at pioneer depths between 3.8 and 5.1 kilometers deep, potentially making them the deepest offshore wells in the world, positioned in one of the fastest currents in the world, topping out at about 9.3 kilometers an hour. CJCM has taken them to court, and I'm sure Cassandra will tell us more about that. This week, we've heard that Total, Shell, and Petro SA want to sink exploratory wells in our fishing, migratory routes, and fish spawning waters off Cape Town. Banning offshore oil and gas extraction would lift some of the major polluting enclosures, negatively affecting communities whose cultural identity and livelihoods depend on their involvement in small-scale fishing and related activities. Offshore offshore oil and gas, PECISA has made negligible contribution to the 1 million jobs promised by the program in 2014. This petro-imaginary of the vast blank space full of hydrocarbon resources has had massive impacts to our oceans and ocean inhabitants. Very likely, this audience understands the gravity and pressing urgency of how compromised our seas are and their role in our weather system, and I'm sure Professor Singh will expand on this. So the South African coastline of 2,800 kilometers is vulnerable to sea level rise. A just transition to climate resilient coastal communities will require serious focus by government to move from failure of implementation to proactive risk-informed development. Decisions to relocate existing at-risk communities could disempower already relatively disadvantaged groups. New development in areas likely to become impacted or uninhabitable has proven lethal. Vulnerable property investment risks also transferred to the public purse. Salman and Sundhi recently highlighted the mismatch between human rights-driven policy with implementation in the management of small-scale fisheries. I'm not going to go into the echoes. Their suggestions are that civil society and academia help ensure inclusion of the vulnerable small-scale fisheries and rights-holding entities to secure their livelihoods. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea's Common Heritage of Mankind principle was wrapped with sugary humanist rationales, but now poses questions about the efficacy of valorizing the ocean as distributive commons, as a common asset over which humanity has entitlement and which has to be shared equitably and intergenerationally under the auspices of a governance system, if it has allowed to be captured by the global extractive and petro-imaginary. The red zones here are mining zones. The Commons vision has been undermined by the United Nations Convention on Law through legal provisions allowing states considerable leeway to extend their authority and claims offshore. The international seabed, which together with its mineral resources is poised to shrink by some 37 million square kilometers, twice the size of Russia, as a result of extended continental shelf claims. South Africa's extended continental shelf project began officially in 2002, and total potential claim is approximately 940,000 square kilometers, of which 1/3 is made up by potential claims around island territories. The challenge remains how to rein in on territorial fantasies that have now acquired legal force. How prepared are we to broach the idea of not exploiting the oceans at all? The age-old use of and deep spiritual connection to the oceans with some of the oldest practices in the world is a very rich aspect of South African heritage. Our coastal peoples, whose inextricable relationship with the ocean goes back many generations, having withstood repeated dispossession and injustice. This ocean commons has been largely ignored by the oil majors investing offshore, with a resultant lack of community consultation. These became major points being argued in the legal action brought against Sasol ENI, Shell, and Searcher by CJCM, traditional healers and leaders, fishers and fishery co-ops, Coastal Links, Green Connection, and I'll leave the details of these victories for discussion by Cassandra and Maia. South African citizen-led campaign galvanized against Shell's exploration right, issued for operating off the wild coast, was probably one of the highlights of my life and my own ocean activism. Our approach to defending the ocean commons is two-pronged. Public participation process. It's imperative that we engage government in legislature, policy, regulations, permit applications, and appeals that pertain to oil and gas development that might affect our oceans. We do this in the faith that it might affect outcomes. We also do this as diligently as possible to support any legal case that may emerge from injustices in these dealings. We put the importance of the sea in the center of these engagements. To do this, we often invite scientists or experts into conversation with the most affected parties. This has an empowering effect both ways and grows our network and supporters' trust. There is huge importance in contesting the notion of the sea as mere resource or property, and which is invariably enforced over protected, sacred, and heritage sites in the EEZ. We call for development of policy matched to the scale of the climate challenges we face. We demand equity and participation, since largely excluded, vulnerable communities are among the most reliant on the functioning and predictable ocean. Collective action, we strive for solidarity on the issue of ocean protection for planetary health by calling for the end to offshore oil and gas in South Africa. This consensus grows in relations set up in group workshops, film screenings, and Q&A sessions. Solidarity is achieved face-to-face, sharing lived experiences. Our aim is to drop the silos around interested groups and focus on what can be achieved collectively. Our networks are large. We watch the ocean, we involve the youth, we follow the boats, we follow the money, the conflicts of interest, the conflicts and violence, the strandings, the deals behind closed doors, and we follow the latest science. We organize events, the list is long, that will focus public and media attention on the issue and garner support and put pressure on agents able to shift or change processes. We believe in the emergent youth and climate justice movement, and we host and facilitated targeted school climate strikes. We hold to disciplined and non-violent civil disobedience. We believe that the continued government inaction over the climate crisis and ecological crisis now justifies peaceful protest and direct action. We understand the critical role social media can play in mobilization, empowerment, and shaping opinions. Government and oil corporates push the common benefits of gas and limit or make harms invisible. It is our duty to put these harms center front and to change the narrative. There's a suggestion that's come out from these latest cases, and that it's vital that when we're dealing with lawyers and legalese, that they are fully informed. Very often the issues are not tangible or are seen to be inconsequential to many. Like, for instance, how do kilometers of dead plankton affect the greater anthropocentric scheme of things? The answers might involve science or local and indigenous knowledge, and hence the importance of getting all these people in communication with each other. If transitional change is the aspiration, allow me to peg my aspirations and a target of 30% of coastal and marine waters designated as marine protected areas or other effective conservation measures needs to be set as a matter of urgency. Some have even advocated to raise this to half the Earth's surface. The intrinsic value of the ocean and its biodiversity should be recognized, and upholding their legal rights to exist, flourish, and evolve could provide the paradigm shift we need. It entails an expansion beyond anthropocentric notions of equity and rights to explicitly encompass the natural world and its components. And I'm going to end there and refer back to you. So I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Janet, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Maia, I'll hand over to you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Charles, and thank you very much, Janet, for your input. Yeah, as mentioned, my name is Maia, and I'm the research officer at Masipendise Development Trust. Masipendise is an organization that works towards the empowerment and capacity building of small-scale fishing communities across South Africa. And that's in order for them to be able to advocate for their own rights and recognition as small-scale fishers. And we work with communities across the coast of South Africa, as well as some inland fishing communities, and our programs are all operating under the umbrella of food sovereignty. So today, as World Earth Day, and in terms of defending our ocean commons, I think that it is important to not only consider the oceans in terms of their conservation, and especially in terms of biological diversity, because the oceans are also an extremely important site for food, nutrition, and a deep cultural connection as well for coastal communities. In South Africa, it's an estimated 30 million people who are moderately to severely food insecure and facing malnutrition. And the oceans can be an important space for relieving that, especially in vulnerable coastal communities, which small-scale fishing communities often are, often rural, marginal, and poor communities who rely on marine resources to support their lives and livelihoods and ensuring local food and nutrition security. And these are communities that have been living and working in the ocean space for generations, and so thereby have a natural understanding of the cycles of nature and the need to use marine resources in a sustainable manner, and in order to ensure that their futures and their children's futures can be supported by the use of these natural marine resources, and also through the cultural and traditional practices that are tied to the oceans. And thereby coastal communities are and should be the custodians of the ocean space. However, in South Africa, conservation, rather than taking from this indigenous knowledge and traditional cultural connection with the oceans, conservation is often in more exclusionary and, in fact, racist in South Africa. And I just want to highlight that small-scale fishing communities are necessary actors in the protection of the oceans. And as Janet said as well, it's important to build solidarity with small-scale fishing communities, coastal communities, and other actors in the ocean space to support and recognize these communities and the role that they play in feeding local communities, supporting the local economy, ensuring food and nutrition security at the local level. But yeah, in South Africa, there are many threats that small-scale fishing communities face on a daily basis. And the system under which South Africa operates, unfortunately, focuses more on profits over people and lives and livelihoods. And we see this often, and it is evident through the rapid advancement of the blue economy, through projects such as Operation Pakisa, which Janet also mentioned, and now through the current development of the Oceans Economy Master Plan, both of which have a very clear emphasis on and a favor towards the development of oil and gas exploration, coastal and marine mining, shipping and transport, and all of this while excluding the voice of coastal fishing communities and small-scale fishing communities. And South Africa, in line with that focus on profit over people, tends to favor the formal economy and placing value on the sector primarily on its contribution to the GDP rather than the sector's intrinsic ability to support the local community and local economies. But the GDP is an extremely simplistic tool for the measurement of the value of the sector, and that disregards the informal economy, which is an extremely important form of employment and enabler of economic mobility within communities, especially at that rural local level. And we see that coastal communities are the first to feel the effects of the ecological crisis, and marginal communities bear the brunt of the race, gender, and class injustices that are experienced across South Africa. And so coming back to the point that Janet was also making of the importance of building solidarity between the different users of the ocean space, but also through different organizations and researchers and academics. So recently, through much collaboration and collective action and solidarity, the High Court case of small-scale fishers and others against Searcher was one. Searcher was applying for rights to begin seismic surveying along the west coast, and the small-scale fishers won this case against Searcher. And the importance of the win of this case is that it was recognized by the judge, most notably that the that there was no consultation with communities, and that they were not considered in the decision-making processes. Similarly, in February, Shell was also successfully prevented from commencing seismic surveying on the East Coast. And these are just some examples of how, through collective action and solidarity, the people can take the power back into their own hands and play a role in the decision-making processes. And it is these kind of wins that we need to build on and support South Africa in moving away from this focus on profit over people, and away from finding new oil and gas and investing in that, and moving towards renewable energy resources in a process that includes and highlights and recognizes the voices of marginal communities and fishing communities whose lives and livelihoods depend on the resources, marine resources, and also supports and recognizes the deep cultures and traditions that are associated with the ocean and coastal areas. So yes, we call for a just transition and building solidarity and collective action of all the different sectors. And as Janet was also saying, yeah, moving away from such a siloed approach in order to strengthen the voice that we can all have together in bringing South Africa to a better space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maia. Cassandra, over to you. Please unmute.
Yep, there we go. Let me just share my screen. Is my presentation up?
Yes, it's up.
Okay. So as Charles has introduced, I am Cassandra, and I am from the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, or as we are commonly known, CJCM. So I think I'm actually quite excited because of the diversity amongst the panel. Especially, we started off with Janet, and she knows her science and her facts and her figures. And then Maia is on the ground with the communities in that livelihood space. And I think, like for CJCM and the work that we do with the Ocean Commons, it's really in between both of those aspects. So our story as CJCM began 27 years ago in South Durban. And we're really a non-governmental organization representing 21 community and environmental organizations concerned with environmental justice and sustainable development in South Durban and KZN. but we also support a lot of organizations around South Africa and partner with many other organizations across Africa and internationally. CJCM, I think one of the most important things is that we represent vulnerable and disadvantaged people whose lives and livelihoods and jobs, as well as small businesses, depend on the protection of ecosystems in KwaZulu-Natal and the vicinity of Durban itself. CJCM has, for the last 2 decades, participated in forums for the improvement of environmental management in KZN, and in particular in the industrial areas of South Durban. For 27 years, we have been defending the commons and the rights of the most vulnerable, and our battle over the years has also included defending the ocean commons, because that is one of the most critical ecosystems that we have. So then we come to the ocean, which is what we're discussing here today. And we all know already the diversity that's found in the ocean and the natural systems. And I think an important element just to add, of course, for those watching, is just to remember that a large part of the ocean does also provide, the ocean does provide a large part of our oxygen, and is also to a large part involved in our natural ecosystems and weather systems, and it helps shape a lot of our environment that we live in terms of weather and climate as well. So basically, so the ocean gives us life, and it impacts our quality of life, and that's what we're finding out more as we speak to more sectors and groupings and communities. And Maia has also mentioned that there's a lot of different people have different relationship with the ocean, whether you depend on it or you use it as a vacation spot or for your quality of life. Studies have shown that being near the ocean, in the ocean, it makes people happier, healthier, and more connected, and it just makes people better. I suppose that's why a lot of people from other provinces, especially Joburg, come do the migration to Durban every year, or to the coastline, just to have that the feel of the beach. So it does improve our life. So coming back to CJCM, our story when it comes to defending the ocean commons is one of firstly people. So the link that we all have to the ocean, defending the ocean commons, begins with people. We have learned over the years that people are crucial to winning any battle. So building relationship and connections help us build the movement. Our work involves working with a range of people from other environmental organizations to small grassroots movements, community-based organizations, religious organizations, individuals, schools, traditional healers, as well as those that rely on the oceans directly for their livelihoods, and that's the fishers. The fishers in KZN have become the watchdogs of the ocean, as we like to say. They understand the ocean, its health, the biodiversity, and any pollution affecting the water, they experience it first. The relationship with the fishers has been key to defending the ocean commons, and including more groups that have not been part of the discussion around the ocean commons, especially on government side, is important to us, especially groups such as the traditional healers, who rely on the ocean for medicinal purposes as well as spiritual aspects. So the ocean has an impact in a lot of sectors, and we found it crucial for these groups, all groups that rely on the ocean, to understand the impacts of what selling off the ocean is going to do in search of oil and gas, and how it will directly impact them and their access to the beach and their relationship to the ocean. So for us, we found that mapping key groups within each area, so whichever area you're in, mapping the groups that utilize our ocean commons, working towards building relationships with these groups, networking and educating them on the actual impacts is always a great starting point to defending the ocean commons. And then our story then also is shaped largely by our purpose as CJCM. In building these relationships with people, there's also an important element of sharing the importance of oceans as well as our purpose as an organization. Because it's in sharing this purpose and meeting people where they're at to take the time to educate them on the science behind it all and their rights, that people begin to share this common vision, and you win them over to be able to mobilize them, which then allows us to be more proactive. So defending the ocean commons, the environment at large, and the most vulnerable in our communities depends heavily on us as an organization to be proactive in communicating around development and comments, proactive in mobilizing communities for protests, community meetings, training, to ensure that our ocean commons are protected. And building relationships with people and organizations, sharing our vision and purpose allows us to call on communities and organizations to come out when we need them, and also allows us to have those numbers and people backing us and backing each other, which then makes us proactive. So we're not waiting for corporations to come and to just run the course and do what they need to. We are actually actively taking space. What we also found works well is working with legal advisors to strategically fight against big corporations, such as Cecil and Eni, which we have been involved in, ExxonMobil, Shell, just to name a few. And it's all part of being proactive when it comes to defending the ocean commons. So the other important element with our work and what we do is being involved also in commenting and taking part in terms of policy and legislation. So ultimately, in order to ensure change, we have to ensure that policies and legislation are affected positively to ensure that the environment and people are protected. So being involved in creating spaces for new policy, which is part of our work that we're currently doing, where we're looking at the KZN subsistence fisherfolk policy. We're trying to get the government to recognize subsistence fishermen here in KZN, because we don't have co-ops, which the government actually recognizes. So that's one of our current sites. So that's creating a space for new policy and also ensuring that our voices are heard on proposed policies and the community understands the impacts of these policies. And I think one of those that we recently were with, and I think Janet was also there with her comments, if I recall, was the gas amendment bill. They did the whole road show, and we were invited to comment and to present on what we thought it was, but the public participation was poor. And with the gas amendment bill, there's knock-on consequences. I mean, it's not just straightforward as they would like us to assume. It would link back to our ocean commons and affect our land as well. And another area we're also involved in is working with our marine protected areas, especially off our coastline. So dealing with policy allows us to ensure that our present and future is secure, because once it's legislated in black and white, it's easier to defend. And our work specifically involves holding workshops, training around pollution, EIAs, oil and gas and livelihoods, as well as renewable energy in and around Durban, as well as in Richards Bay, which is where we have one of our offices, which is there at the beginning of this year. Richards Bay, as you know, is a hub for major industries and future petrochemical industries. And as a port, it's seen as an economic development opportunity. But it's been key for us to take space on our coastline and to take charge of those spaces and make those communities involved, especially with all our work here on the Durban port, just so that people are aware of the consequences, because most often they're not, government communicates a watered down version of what the reality actually is and the effects and the science. They don't really present on the actual research and consequences, especially with the oceans. So we've also been involved in mobilizing communities, which is what we feel creates presence and takes space, especially along our coastline, to protect it. And as the other two speakers spoke about, the seismic surveys with Shell off our East Coast, being involved in that, getting the people out, calling on them. And this is always through our networks, relationships, working with other organizations, to be able to get those numbers out there. And of course, most of these people already understand our vision and our purpose, so it's easier to call on them. Creating spaces is also important to strategize as a collective. And that was one of our key objectives at our national strategy meeting, which was the first that we had in February this year, an anti-oil and gas workshop. So that's really creating a platform for collaboration, for networks, because with the oil and gas and with our oceans and the race for selling our oceans and for all these tests, it's actually important for us when we look at the ocean commons to work smart and not hard, because we have an entire coastline and us as South Durban can't be running all over. So when Searcher was doing their, filing their papers and protesting on the West Coast, we couldn't get there, but we knew that Green Connection was there, Masifundisi was there, and a lot of other organizations on the West Coast, and we would support them on this side. On the East Coast, we had a few protests in support of the West Coast, and likewise also what took place with the Shell. The entire coastline came out. So it's this collective action that we are always promoting. And it's also important for us to create future activists. And I'm sure many of you are aware that in most cases, our activists that have been long in the struggle are getting older. And it's always important to, if I could say, have succession planning and educate the youth, get them involved, bring them in, build that vision and passion in them, and create platforms for them to speak, because they do have a lot to say. So creating future activists among the youth, we do that as part of our Earth Day initiative today. We were at Aliwell Shoal this morning with 3 schools from South Durban. We took them there. They've never been to Aliwell Shoal. They didn't even know about it. Educating them, tying them into climate change, those extreme rains that we had last week in Durban, in KZN, seeing the effects, the litter, the coastline, the damage. I mean, as we drove down South Durban, the containers were all over the roads. We had to be diverted. And I think as youth, it's important for them to tie the theory to the practical and see things in real time and participate. So involving the youth with that and giving them firsthand experience. And also, Janet also spoke to this, part of it also with our work is taking up legal cases, because while we are mobilizing to protect our ocean commons, it's also making sure that legally we also have a foothold and that the government will take us seriously and that they understand that we are, of course, serious about our cause. So taking up legal cases and being vocal and active in big corporates in the oil and gas space. And as I mentioned, we've been working on cases with Sasol and Eni and Shell and Total. And they've recently come back to us, of course, to hold discussions. So we're currently speaking to our legal advisors as a way forward with them, because they, of course, are applying for environmental authorization. And we've been involved with car power ships and Tasako as well. And a lot of developments, of course, coming up in Richards Bay, which is why we thought, of course, it's strategic to have an office there and start educating. Richards Bay now, your coastline is under threat. what do you need to do? How can you get involved? So educating communities on legislation and policy is key. And also finding new ways to create awareness of the importance of the ocean has been one that is critical. And I think one of our latest endeavors, if I could say, was in collaboration with One Ocean Hub, DUT, where we put on a showcase to at the KZN Gallery that really showed the fish's relationship with the ocean, and share that with the public openly. We use local artists to take pictures, capture their stories. Their stories are all at fishestales.org. And I think that's a creative way to bring the public, the majority in to experience the ocean, what a certain sector sees the ocean at, and the importance, because of course they rely on the ocean for their livelihoods. So awareness creates the connection, and then the connection creates the action, which is what we found works best, especially when it comes to the ocean commons. So the story that we want as SETSI, after 27 years of defending the commons, the story that we want is a future where we can secure the future and livelihoods of workers and their communities in low carbon to zero carbon economy, all based on social dialogue between workers and their unions, employers, government, and communities. So moving towards a just transition. And the story one is one that works with natural environmental processes, traditional knowledge with localized community-based solutions. As long as the power rests with the few, our story is and will always be to continue to represent vulnerable and disadvantaged persons whose lives, livelihoods, jobs, and small businesses depend on the protection of these ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. Professor Singh. Professor Singh, over to you.
Everyone. So because of the floods we've had in Durban, I actually don't have fiber. So I'm just using a mobile modem. So I'm not going to put my visual on because it'll just totally disrupt it. But what I'm going to try to do is to do a screen share and just take it from there.
Thank you.
Just give me a second just to get my screen share. Okay. Okay, I hope you guys can see the screen now.
It's just loading.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, we can see it now.
Great. So I do think it's a fantastic occasion to reflect on where we are and what we can do on Earth. Probably no more appropriate way than this one. So thank you for those of you who actually got in touch with me, put this out for me to join here. It was really interesting also just listening to the other presentations. And I think what I'm going to do is probably end up doing a presentation that's complementary in some ways to the presentations that have been given already. Because what I'll be doing is giving this a little bit more of a wider scope of analysis in terms of what the ocean commons also entails. So I'll start off by maybe just beginning with my presentation. And I think what I want to just maybe do is begin by just emphasizing that when we speak about the oceans commons at the international level, we're actually speaking about a very different thing. And so I think, it's first of all important to start off with a definition. What is the oceans common? And, at the international level, the oceans common refers to a spatial domain, which of course could be anything. But in particular, it's looking at areas beyond national jurisdiction. If you look at a lot of international papers and instruments, legal instruments, they always speak about the ABNJ, which means areas beyond national jurisdiction. So as we know, South Africa has an exclusive economic zone. It extends about 200 kilometers offshore, but all the areas beyond that is what most of the world actually comprises. So all countries have exclusive jurisdiction over their maritime waters, but essentially the areas that exist beyond territorial claims is what most often in international circles is referred to as the ocean commons. And essentially what we're talking about here are two different constituents in a sense. So the two different zones or maritime zones that are located in the areas beyond national jurisdictions. First one is the seabed, the ocean floor, and the subsoil. And this is a very specific place. And, you know, this is at major risk, and I'll come back to this a bit later when you're looking at seabed mining. But the seabed and ocean floor and the subsoil is classified as one of the two maritime zones that are located in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. And then separate from that is all parts of the sea that are not included in the exclusive economic zone. So we're looking at literally all the waters and not just you know, the seabed itself. So all what we know more popularly as the high seas is the second part of this. And both zones, of course, constitute the common heritage of humankind. And I'm talking about regardless of whether you are a country that is landlocked, to whether you in fact are a country that has a coastal zone, but essentially this is the common heritage of humanity. So we've got to make sure that the ocean commons is protected. So where are we now with the ocean commons, and what exactly are the threats to the ocean commons? Well, there are many, many, many threats, and some of us who have spoken already have highlighted some of these in the domestic space. And of course, you know, you can't speak about protecting the domestic space or the international space without referring to the other, because as we know, when you have an oil spill, even if it's a tanker that is more than beyond South Africa's maritime borders, the oil can very easily reach South Africa. So we've got to look at what are the threats to the ocean commons, because they impact on national boundaries, they impact on the international seas as well. So 2/3 of the ocean, of the world's ocean, is beyond national jurisdiction. And you know, this represents about 95% of the entire Earth's habitat. So you can imagine the amount of biological diversity in the ocean. And just less than 20% of the seafloor has been mapped to 100 meters or more for high resolution. And so there's lots and lots of mounting evidence that there is horrible impacts on marine biodiversity from human activities. So the major gaps that we have right now is that existing regulations on common activities like large-scale commercial fishing, we're talking about massive trawlers that will put down a net that would be kilometers long. It just drags on the ocean floor, picks up anything that is going to be dragged along. And a lot of life actually ends like that, even though it may not be the target of what they're looking for. It's once it's been caught up in that net, it dies. And so there's a lot of existing regulations that don't apply, they don't adequately conserve biodiversity. And so you'll find that as a result, marine life in the oceans common is facing increasing threats. We have now more than 7 billion humans on Earth, probably inching up to 7.5 billion. And we're going to reach 8 billion and it's going to hit 10 billion within a few years. So we're not at that point where we can say we are more responsibly protecting the oceans commons. In fact, if anything, because of increasing demands and because of course, commercial factors, there's a lot of commercial greed out there. The ocean commons are facing an increasing threat. And we're talking about threats from over exploitation of the oceans, from pollution, from climate change, and of course, the emerging threat of seabed mining. So that's a major, major issue. In fact, there's potential threats of seabed mining even off South Africa's coast as well. So when we're talking about seabed mining, we're talking about even over and above exploiting our coastal zones for oil and gas. We're talking about, for example, De Beers maybe looking for diamonds off the coast of Namibia and looking at diamonds off the Orange River Delta. So, those are the types of issues that the Oceans Common is facing. But of course, this is beyond national borders now. So there has been a recognition for a while that the world urgently needs a very strong, legally binding, conservation-focused treaty to govern the world's oceans. So where are we with that? So, there has been an attempt to bring an international legal treaty because currently there's a very antiquated system of regional and sectoral bodies that try to govern different activities. So you may find there'll be an agreement on fishing or overfishing. There'll be something on habitat destruction. There'll be a separate treaty, maybe on pollution. Plastic pollution is an emerging threat, but there's no coherent treaty or law that governs all of those types of threats. But thankfully, through the UN for a long time now, this has been over 10 years in the making, governments have been negotiating a league binding treaty to improve conservation and especially biodiversity in the high seas. So where are we now with this process? So this has been going on for over 10 years, lots and lots of negotiations. As you can imagine, there's a lot of vested interest with larger economies in particular, but careful about not ceding too much of a protection because they are relying on the big multinationals to bring in tax revenue for their home bases. And of course, there are lots of rich people who influence politicians as well. We can't be naive to that. So it has taken a while. And this was supposed to have been, in fact, concluded to a certain degree by 2020. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the General Assembly of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, known as UNCLOS, they actually ended up postponing the International Convention, Intergovernmental Conference. And essentially, this was due to take place in March. The meeting took place. It concluded on the 18th of March, so it's almost hot off the press. And unfortunately, the negotiations didn't conclude, but by several different accounts that I've heard of anyway, the negotiations were quite advanced and things moved along faster than what people expected. So negotiations are due to recommence in August 2022, so keep an eye out for that. But that type of legal treaty will have wide-ranging implications for both the international seas and the common oceans, and also domestically as well. So where are we now? And what exactly is the convention focused on? Well, the negotiations are focused on four main parts: marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So we've heard some of the previous speak about marine protected areas. They were referring to, of course, within South Africa, but now there's been recognition that marine protected areas within national borders is not enough. We need marine protected areas for the open oceans as well. So I think this will be a very big game changer if this can finally get done. I have my doubts with certain issues like who's going to police this, but there's an attempt to move in this direction. There's also another component is capacity building and technology transfer. As we know, we have low and middle income country settings. There's very little capacity, and especially with regard to technology to monitor the states of the oceans, there's very little of that. And so, for example, I think if I'm not mistaken, in Africa, the country that has the largest coastline is Somalia. But as we know, Somalia is one of the poorest countries. It hasn't really had a stable government for a very long time. And so, of course, there's virtually no monitoring of the oceans happening in territorial waters, let alone international waters of Somalia. And of course, another big focus area, which of course some of us are more familiar with, especially in the context of South Africa and recent oil and gas explorations, is the issue of environmental impact assessment. So this is something that's been quite interesting. And I just thought I'll very, very briefly highlight out of the four, what's happening in the international space on environmental impact assessment. So we as in the world, currently lacks a coherent environmental impact assessment framework for activities that can have an impact in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the objectives in the proposed provisions of the proposed treaty will clearly state that environmental impact assessments for activities with the potential for harmful effects on biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions should meet minimum international standards. And the revised draft text that has been circulated includes a list of general steps that are required. And I think, this is an important factor to take into account, because in many countries, you find that environmental impact assessment studies are done by the very companies they paid for and commissioned by the very companies who want access to certain spaces. So there's always a question as to whether the consultants or the company that are doing the impact assessments are actually really neutral. If there's no arm's length distance between them, they could in fact have a much more, because they want to get future work, those who are doing the assessments, so they give a much more lenient report. So there has been, thought of that. And of course, countries have also been quite reluctant to allow for any impact assessment studies done in their country to apply internationally and vice versa. And part of the reason is that they fear that, if there's an oil spill, for example, it could go beyond the country's borders. So they don't really want, there's been no real appetite globally for governments to really want environmental impact assessment studies to be done where within country borders applies outside or vice versa. And of course, as we know, water is water. It's going to just spread wherever it is, and it's going to cross boundaries. So these are some of the factors that I think have hampered an international environmental impact assessment. So this is something that is being negotiated now. It'll be interesting to see where this goes and where things take off in August 2022. But I thought I'll just put it out there that of these four, the marine genetic resources, area-based management, capacity building, and technology transfer, and environmental impact assessments, that this is, these are the four main components. And even with marine genetic resources, there's been a big push by low and middle income countries to say that, if there's going to be exploitation of marine resources and genetic resources, for example, you find a cure for cancer by harvesting cells from an octopus, which is very good at regeneration. Well, those benefits, there has to be benefit sharing, and it can't be just rich countries that patent this technology. This has to be good benefit sharing for low and middle income country settings. So these are some of the smaller issues that are coming up in the discussions. But essentially, in conclusion, and I won't take any more time, in conclusion, we're not where we should be in protecting the oceans common, but we are getting closer to formal protection at the international level. And I'm pretty certain, because this is a consensus document, it's not going to be perfect. You can't have a document passed by unanimity where everybody has to vote for it, but you're going to get some people to dissent. Some clauses are going to get watered down. But, I think negotiators face a tough task, because you either don't have a treaty at all, or you have something that everybody's going to be happy with. So I think this is where things are now, between the final meeting that was concluded in March and where things pick up in August. I'm sure we're going to get further along. But, I think in conclusion, the oceans are significantly important, and all the speakers before me emphasized this. The oceans have absorbed more than 90% of the excess heat from climate change, and a quarter of carbon dioxide's emissions that humans produce, that we produce by burning fossil fuel, has been absorbed by the oceans. And at the same time, our influence on climate change is affecting the oceans in dire ways. So the ocean is currently at the warmest it's ever been since measurements began. It's the most acidic it's ever been in the last 14 million years. If there's not a ringing bell that says this is anthropocentric or human inspired, I can't imagine what else is. And it's losing oxygen every year. And of course, as we know, oxygen is critical for marine life. So given the impact of the oceans on climate change and climate regulation around the world, the impact of climate change and on the oceans and the oceans on climate change, I think it's very, very important for communities and civil society organizations to give impact on South Africa's draft climate change bill. The bill has now been put out for comment. I've had, the pleasure of listening to 3 fantastic speakers before me. And your organizations need to get very involved in looking at the draft climate change bill. And I think our main task is to future-proof the bill, to make it as strong as we can, because if we don't do anything about this now, with vested interests in politics and big business being very close, we're not going to get good protection in 5 or 10 years from now. So I think our opportunity is to put whatever we need to put into the bill right now. And I strongly encourage people to read and review the proposed, the draft climate change bill, and to give your input and send it directly through to government. So I'll end there, but thank you very much for giving me the time, and I look forward to engaging with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much to all our panelists. The floor is now open to all our attendees. You are free to write your comments, your questions, or any engagement in the chat, but we strongly recommend that you raise your hand and you will be allowed to speak. When people speak, at least the webinar becomes much more interactive than comments written in the chat. I do not see hands now, so let me just ask Maia. Oh, before I do, I see one hand from Jackie.
And sorry, while you may be looking for the hand, I'm just looking at only the comments now on the screen. So I just see some people said the screen froze. So apologies, I didn't realize that. But when my screen is on full share, I don't see any of the comments. So I'm not sure if you guys saw the slides, but hopefully if you didn't, the narrative along with it was clear. So apologies for that.
Thank you so much, Prof. Jackie?
Yes, thank you very much, Charles. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to commend all of our speakers and say thank you very much for this excellent and very important webinar. And just coming back, wanted to pick up on one or two things that Janet really started with, but I think it touches on all four of the speakers' inputs, is this issue of the role of civil society and the governance aspect in South Africa, because as Janet highlighted, we don't have an overarching policy or legislative framework for our ocean in South Africa. And as Professor Singh has highlighted, I mean, globally we're realizing how important this is. But I think this gap in South Africa is becoming more and more obvious now. And recently I've tried to go back to look at the sequence of events and the Marine Spatial Planning Bill, which has now become an act, and try to understand how did we end up with this gap. And as Janet mentioned, there was talk originally of an oceans policy in 2013. There was a draft oceans policy actually gazetted, and then that quickly fell off the table because Operation Pakisa pushed ahead and offered the Marine Spatial Planning Act as the alternative overarching framework. And I just wanted to point out to the other listeners and to the guest speakers that it's really incredibly interesting to go back to the public hearings on the Marine Spatial Planning Bill in Parliament, which I went to recently looking at the PMG reports. And the Portfolio Committee was particularly anxious about how this issue of the ecological would be balanced with the economic in the absence of an oceans policy. And the chair of the Portfolio Committee in October 2017 was at pains to raise this repeatedly with the department and with the then Minister of Environment. And the department's legal representative, Radia, was very defensive and said, no, don't worry, we'll be balancing we'll make sure the Marine Spatial Planning Act is how we will balance the social, ecological, and the economic issues. And we're now in a situation where the bill became an act and then was entered into force on the 1st of April of last year. And yet I hear behind the scenes now that there's no appetite to implement the act, and we certainly haven't seen it. Last month, the department released what they say is the background data information report that is supposed to pave the way for marine spatial planning. But even though the report was released last month, it is completely outdated. It is shockingly outdated. It's as if it was written 5 years ago. The information is so poor. So the comment I'm making really is to agree that it's this, the issue of governance and the role of civil society in holding our government to account. And how do we now try and make sure that we have a legislative and policy framework that we can hold them to account to? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for that important question. Before I go to Patrick, do any of our panelists want to respond to Jackie?
Jackie, just to thank you for that, because it fills in for the audience the issues around the Marine Spatial Planning Bill Act. I went to a number of the meetings, the public participation meetings, and I was deeply, deeply concerned about the lack of any real sense of the ecological in those meetings whatsoever. I have film footage of a number of the meetings, if necessary, if you're needing further research. But it's yeah, it's of massive concern. I mean, I think considering what Durban's just been through now, I'm just echoing the same sentiments, is that when is government going to pull their finger out to actually consolidate these issues in some kind of balanced form? And then what do we do about it as civil society? I think we just keep poking. We just keep poking them with a stick. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Janet. Patrick, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks, dear comrades. It's been very, very enlightening. I'm very learning all the time from you, and it's exceptionally good to have a good wide variety, fisher folk, marine conservationists, from the academic standpoint, having Asif pick up these topics, Jerome. Thank you so much. But on the economics, I do actually look at this closely, and I just put a piece on the chat box from Janet's website about questioning. It's really what Maia said, this sense of GDP, which does not do pollution or the depletion of non-renewable resources. It simply leaves out two of the most critical aspects of environmental economics. So it does strike me that that's one of the sites we can really be much more aggressive on. I say that with two things in mind. One is that the Parliament, especially that Environment Committee, you know, just 2 weeks before we had the engine explosion, December 4, 2020, if I recall, there was an environmental committee meeting on offshore oil and gas. That was Total and Brudpala. They were totally celebratory. They had no clue about any aspect that might be negative for marine life, but also for the climate. And when we've got now a $3,000 per ton, it's more than 45,000 Rand per ton cost of carbon. In other words, 1 ton emitted does that much damage. And if we're doing roughly 500 million tons a year in South Africa, that is essentially 5 times our GDP in costs associated with these emissions. And they're just not quite, you know, able to comprehend the full cost accounting. So I want to push that. But secondly, I want to do that from our team, because we did have a wonderful coalition that started really in November against seismic blasting. Maybe the panelists would also comment on this. How did we do? We've certainly got the marine conservationists and scientists, you know, really wonderful work. And we have the fisher folk and the shoreline communities. And we had, where I'm now in Johannesburg, very good climate activists and activists all over the country worried about climate. But could we do more? Couldn't we do just transition work to bring in labor? Could we bring in youth more forcefully? So I guess that's the other angle I'd like to bring. The youth really are the future of, let's say, the economic depletion of this country's natural resources. And to be able to talk a little bit more openly and confidently about the economic damage strikes me as one of the very sharpest weapons we can use against an enemy that's always saying, no, this is economically a net benefit. So I put a little, piece on the chat box where Janet posted my critique of Treasury, which is both climate denialist and also looking to monetize nature as much as it can. So I'd love to hear if any of you other comrades are thinking through a political economy critique of a blinded bourgeois economics that's not even doing rudimentary environmental economics for cost accounting. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Over to you, to our panelists. I would like to go first. Yes,
I'm happy to respond. Obviously, I've engaged with Patrick on this a number of times, and Patrick, I think the fundamental issue with those numbers is that they feel so unbelievable. And my sense when I talk to people and I peg that tail on the donkey is that there's just no real sense of consequence. So the cause and effect is that connection doesn't get made. And I just wonder if there isn't another way of saying it that might bring home the consequence a little bit stronger. Yeah, it's just because these are statements that we've been making for quite a long time, but it's not adhering, it's not getting traction, it's not sticking. If that makes sense to you at all.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
can I share my own? If I can very, very quickly come back,
Yes,
I think
yes.
you're right. Anything that deals with economics is an, eyes glaze over phenomenon. That's the way they like it, right? That's the jargon, and that's the ethereal character of this field. And yet, I mean, I just came from the Norwegian embassy where I was debating the ambassador there, who represents a country with a massive oil, kind of output, and Equinor, its oil company, was actually drilling, right where you can see, Janet, just offshore. They were doing seismic blasting a few years ago with ExxonMobil. So I put it to them that they owe a huge climate debt. So that's one of the answers to you. And the Chinese, who have the biggest ongoing climate debt, the most emissions, they just paid 1 million rand to Durban for the relief fund. Patrice Motsepe, a coal baron, just paid 30 million. The chair of my university council, UJ Council, Mike Teke from Seriti, a coal baron, just paid 100,000. And I paid a tiny bit too. And I have a huge climate debt because I fly too much and I have a high carbon footprint. So that's my first question, Janet. Isn't it time for people in Durban, like you, to call out the climate debtors in the global north, like me here in Johannesburg, or maybe you as well in Durban? And I think that climate debt, who should be paying the relief bill for all the damage being done, is a very evocative standpoint. Let's applaud Patrice Motsepe and the Norwegian ambassador and the Chinese for making a tiny down payment on what they owe. Secondly, to conclude, the real killer, which you folks at the Climate Justice Movement, Charter Movement, have been putting your finger on, is the fear of sanctions on South African products that have high impact of energy in their export output, right? So if you're producing an export, it'll go to Europe. And I just spent some time, as I said, with some ambassadors talking about the sanctions coming down on South Africa because of a high carbon impact from their exports, which means we get a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a climate sanctions. And so the CJCM has been very good at saying, don't give the 8.5 billion until we clean up the act, the sort of call for boycotting Andre de Ruyter's. I think that's, Janet, the second answer to your question, how to make it real, because these guys who do high carbon, and methane is 80 times worse than carbon over a 100-year period, they're going to add to the burden of the high greenhouse gas inputs that go into the energy, that go into the production of our exports, which mean the more that they drill offshore, the more our climate debt, first of all, but also our liabilities to these sanctions. Now that, again, I'm being ethereal and abstract, but it means that we can't export stuff because we've got too much greenhouse gas inputs into the energy that is used in the exports. I hope that's comprehensible. I hope it's easy to explain to anybody, any worker in any industry that has exports. They're going to have a 30% tax put on them because of the energy that is being used, because it's high carbon, or it'll be even worse with the methane. I hope that makes sense, that sort of full cost accounting hasn't been done. It scares the hell out of them because President Ramaphosa says again and again, we're going to be hit by basically climate sanctions. Business, even BHP Billiton wants to go green in its Richards Bay smelter because it knows it won't be able to export aluminium to Europe starting in a couple of years. So I think that's a killer argument that we have, and we should be using it more. Anyway, sorry about babbling on, but economics now is the critical area where the enemy is strong, and we have to be stronger.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much. Marcus, you can unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I came here late. I'm Marcus Solomon from the Children's Resource Center. Our mission over 40 years has been build a movement of children as different from youth. Now, my main point I want to make here today is people speak much about the wonderful information, and I've always been very informed about some of these things, especially the oceans. I think there are a number of projects in civil society, what people call in civil society, around climate change, saving the planet, etc. I think we need to give a bit more attention to coordinating those activities. But the other thing I want to mention has been my main mission whenever I speak on these platforms, are children. Now, people always speak about youth. 40 years ago, parents reminded us there's another step before youth, and those are children. And one of our big studies has been, so when we started, their children have agency. 30 years ago, we started up cleaning beaches, 30 years ago. Because people have a lot of information about how just to keep the environment clean, but the depth of that information that has come up here today is always very interesting. And I think what we need to do is to make some of that information more accessible. In fact, we're just dealing with we're launching a right of food to children. And what we've discovered, there's a huge amount of scientific knowledge, which is communities need to have. And I think one of the lessons of the past, like the Treatment Action Committee, made very sophisticated scientific knowledge very accessible, and people acted on that. Now, coming back to the children's issue, I think that there's so much. I mean, we're a founding member of the Food Sovereignty Campaign, including the Climate Justice Network Forum. But people very seldom, in fact, some of our coordinators, they complain about sometimes. We are more present in some of these activities than even the unions. The churches, of course, there are. But the issue is, I think we need to build, make the information more accessible, put more effort into building some coordinated effort. There are things. And at a very personal level, I think, but also some of our parents would say, why are people putting so much emphasis on parliament when it's really just a talk shop? We need to build an alternative now to change the planet. And all over the world now, these governments are not going to change neither. In fact, the corporate world is protecting their interests. We are not going to save the climate by policies to government. Let's mobilize our people, including the children. There are 18 million children in this country. They are doing things. We claimed 20 years, 30 years ago. We developed a poster on our website. And I've been asked to participate in these forums as an adult because people don't see. People speak about children being the future. It's a meaningless cliche. They cannot be a future unless they have a now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Cassandra, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I just want to respond to Marcus quickly. I think a lot of our work, although we do say it is with youth, we have noticed that engagement with our primary schools as well as ECD is very important. We have done a lot of engagement with our kids. I think we speak of youth more often because for us, to a certain degree, it's easier to get a youth out of school to educate or to mobilize because they have a bit more, they're older, if I could say. So they're more accessible, whereas the younger group, it takes a bit more planning. We do work with them, but rightfully so, you've pointed out, not enough. And we have identified it and we are building that more into our plans. But again, as you said, our approach needs to be the top and the bottom. We can't always focus on the government. And I think that's what these recent floods in KZN has shown us. We can't sit around and wait. It's a disaster area. There's communities in need, and we can't wait for handouts. So we have to be on the ground and take action and lead by example. So it is there has to be multiple approaches when we're dealing with any environmental issue or any issue. So I do agree. I have made a note of it, and I think one of the main reasons why we also in the situation is because of our education system and our curriculum, which is largely flawed. And that's another topic altogether, which lets us down. It should be supporting progress and supporting environmental works and building in more realistic skills for kids that are actually going to benefit them later in life. It should be starting from basically your preschool all the way to grade 12. You shouldn't only deal with the environment at a later stage. So I do agree there. But again, that's another discussion when it comes to children and engaging. But it is on our radar, and it is a group that we deal with. But of course, we can do more and speak about it more. I think it's good to highlight. And I think just to add before I end, with relation to the governance that was spoken about, I think from our side, we all know that we don't have good governance systems. If there was good governance systems in our country, we would have more transparency. And I think when it comes to the economics of it all and actually counting those costs, we don't want to speak about the numbers to a certain extent because that's too transparent and people are going to see. And once that happens, then who actually has the power? Then there's no one can actually totally hold the power because now everybody knows, which then has that accountability. Then who's going to be accountable now because the numbers are showing one thing. So it's very complex discussion and situation when you're dealing with governance and economics, because in most cases, people want to hold the power and they want to keep their cards close to their chest because if we don't know, they can, of course, carry on. So I just wanted to add that to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cassandra. Janet Solomon also says, Marcus, I agree with you entirely. Happy to liaise with you regarding parceling easy knowledge on offshore oil and gas for kids. Thank you very much to our panelists for this very, very, very important discussion that they led today. Because we are stressed for time, we will jump to the next session now and hear an update on the case that has been launched by the Climate Justice Charter Movement, as well as an update on our petition. I'll hand over to my colleague, Awanda Butelis.
Thank you, Charles. Good afternoon to everyone. And for those who are not aware or who do not know yet, we have launched a case against the President, ministers, deputy chairperson of the Presidential Climate Commission, the Premier of the KZN province, and the Mayor of eThekwini Metro with culpable homicide. So for some background around the case, it is to our understanding and the general knowledge of the public that the South African government has failed to take the climate crisis seriously. And due to this, we've decided to hold them accountable for the dereliction of duty. Not only have they failed, but the government has also signed on to the science. They've accepted the IPCC reports as signatories, notwithstanding all the other IPCC meetings and processes that the government has been part of since the early 90s, but also the most recent reports that have come out from 2021 into this year, the most recent of those being the one which came out this month on mitigation of climate change, the mitigation of climate change report. So the government has confirmed that they believe in the science and understand the need for an urgent climate emergency, yet they have not taken any action and have not yet implemented a just transition, if not a deep just transition. So due to this, and for all those who have been part of the movement, but for all those who are new to the CJCM space, it is also necessary to reiterate that in October 2018, the CJCM, or before the CJCM had formed to what it is today, had called for an emergency sitting of Parliament to deliberate on the significance of the 1.5 IPCC reports that released in 2018. The government ignored us. In 2019, after the devastating floods that had hit KZN in that year, we called for the government to declare a climate emergency, and the government ignored us. And again, in 2020, on World Food Day, during our CJCM assembly, with the Deputy Speaker of Parliament present, to whom we handed over the charter, the memorandum, and the science document, we were once again ignored. And last year, when we returned to Parliament, we were once again ignored. So it is with this understanding and the contradictory nature in which our government has proceeded with regards to its policies on seeking out more oil, gas, and coal investments, we have decided that this is a necessary step to take forward in pursuing and pushing the plight of climate justice. We will try to make sure that we keep everyone updated with regards to what the process is moving forward, as we've laid these charges at various police stations. And we've also written to Shamila Batoy and the new national chairperson of, National Commissioner of Police, to petition them to take this case seriously at the national level. I'd also want to remind everyone that we do have a petition running right now to halt all investments into South Africa's Just Transition Plan until our government stops its pursuit or new investments into oil, gas, and coal. That petition has been running for the past month and will continue to run until later on in the year during the time of the COP summit that will be happening in Egypt this year. We will share that petition into the chat for all of those who have not yet signed the petition or have not yet encountered the petition. We've already received thousands of signatures, and we hope that you will share it widely and continue to support the petition, which Charles has just added right now in the chat. We're hoping that obviously we can get as many signatures as we can. And then we will also make sure to send this petition to the various embassies of the countries that sought to send investment to South Africa, and obviously to the IPCC itself. So we want to thank all of you for joining us today. The month of April has been a climate justice charter focused on the rights of nature and natural climate solutions. Last month, we focused on water issues, and we'll continue to have thematical focuses throughout the year as we continue to pursue this fight of climate justice. So I just want to thank everyone for the time that they've made to attend this webinar today. I want to thank our panelists also for affording us not only their time, but their intellect also in sharing with us, and also taking the time out that they've given to answer some of the questions. I hope that you all continue to engage with the work that is being done by activists across the country. If you'd like to be appraised of what's going on, also, please make sure to follow us at CJ Charter SA on Twitter, so that we can continue to keep you updated with all the latest news. So that we can also keep you updated with all the news and everything that we'll be having coming up. So please, if you have not yet, please do sign the petition and make sure to share it widely. And with that, I think we'll be ending the program for today. So once again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you everyone for making your time, and thank you to the panelists once again.